Is Joe Biden serious when he claims that the United States is not at war?
Well, that's what he said in his first public address since he dropped out of the presidential race. He said, I'm proud, I'm happy to report that no American soldiers, that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world, which is false on so many levels. First of all, the U.S. is currently waging a belligerent occupation of Syria, where they're stealing Syria's oil and wheat to deprive Syria of the chance to rebuild after Syria was decimated by a decade-long U.S.-backed dirty war. And that's technically war because Syria doesn't want the U.S. there. They've asked them to leave. And hence, you have constant flare-ups where U.S. soldiers are attacked. Did Joe Biden forget that 3 U.S. service members were killed under his watch because they were stationed at the Jordan-Syria border as part of these bases that are stealing Syria's resources? He must have forgotten about that. Those people were at war because they died. On the same night that he said that, the U.S. bombed Yemen, as they've done multiple times under Biden's watch. The Pentagon just said that they've attacked some Houthi vessels in the Red Sea. So the claim that we're not at war while we're engaging in war activities across the world is just, it's a remarkable statement for the president to make. And then, of course, there are the areas that are even more dangerous where the U.S. isn't technically at war because they don't have combat troops there. But the U.S. is fueling 2 catastrophic wars. I mean, the war in Ukraine, obviously. In Gaza, it's hard to call it a war. It's more of a massacre. But the ignorance it takes to say we're not at war when he's fueling 2 of the world's most dangerous conflicts that we've seen in decades, it's just remarkable. It speaks to how out of touch he is and his entire cabinet. And what is he doing to stop any of these conflicts? Nothing that we can see.
And aren't American troops effectively a tripwire in Syria, in Yemen, on Kinmen Island, off the coast of Taiwan? Isn't he basically putting them in harm's way, which will give him an excuse for a full-blown Lindsey Graham championed war?
Absolutely, they are. And think about, how much more in danger they are, not just by virtue of being in Syria, but because of Biden's policies elsewhere. So look, if you're the militias that operate inside Syria, you're tied to Iran, you're tied to the Syrian government, you're tied to Hezbollah, and you want to achieve a ceasefire, then one way to put pressure on the U.S. would be to target these U.S. troops that are sitting ducks at these bases in the middle of Syria. They're just there. They're not there to fight ISIS, as Biden says. They're barely fighting ISIS. And in fact, the U.S. presence in Syria has before encouraged the spread of ISIS, as John Kerry once admitted a long time ago. But so, because of Biden's refusal to call for a ceasefire elsewhere in Gaza, that increases the incentive for these U.S. troops to be attacked inside Syria, because that's one way to put pressure on Biden. Another tripwire aspect of this is that the U.S. and Russia are at direct odds inside Ukraine. And there's been talk of Ukrainians of going over to Syria to fight Russians there. So all these other conflicts that Biden is fueling amplify the dangers in the other conflict zones. And this guy's decision, along with Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken, is rather than to do anything to de-escalate, they're just escalating. And that's why we're seeing now the U.S. deploying new military vessels, submarines, aircraft carriers to the Middle East, because just like Israel, the only language that Biden knows is force.
Chris, do we have President Biden in the Oval Office saying the U.S. is not at war?
I'm the first president in this century to report to the American people that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world. We'll keep rallying a coalition of proud nations to stop Putin from taking over Ukraine and doing more damage.
I believe that was the talk he gave about a week after he withdrew from the Democratic presidential, from the presidential race.
It was. And he's there to reassure Americans, I suppose, because, of course, that was a very humiliating experience for him. But he goes and tries to, reassure Americans by saying one of the most ridiculous things he's ever said, which is, which is a very, impressive feat considering how many ridiculous things that Biden has said over the course of his career. But again, to go before the world and say that we're not at war when he's fueling 2 major catastrophes while engaging in military occupations. I mean, this is a good illustration of why he's just not fit, not only as a candidate, but for office. the recklessness of this administration. I heard Jeffrey Sachs on your show the other day talk about just where this administration will rank. Like Secretary of State Antony Blinken, what does he do? How does he spend his time? Does he ever engage in a single act of diplomacy? One of the most useless Secretary of States in history. Their legacy is not going to be very kind, and it's just, I hope we just can survive the rest of it as long as they're in office for, because everything they do just fuels danger.
The piece that we just put up while you were speaking was Blinken's statement on the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, a statement filled with lies. So two 75th anniversaries within a month. NATO, their failed offensive alliance, and the Geneva Conventions, which we wrote and with which we don't comply. Over the top, we don't comply with it.
And amazingly, so Blinken issues that statement celebrating the Geneva Conventions, the 75th anniversary, and our respect for international humanitarian law. And what does he do less than 24 hours later? He announces, his State Department announces that the U.S. is approving $20 billion in additional military sales to Israel. $20 billion. Right. So he's marking the anniversary of international humanitarian law by shipping off $20 billion worth of new weaponry to the biggest violator of international humanitarian law in the world, which is Israel.
Is Netanyahu in hiding? Is he underground? He hasn't been seen in about 12 days. Do you know?
Well, they do have a bunker that they've talked about where Israeli leaders have been gathering. So, yeah, it makes sense that he's there. They are worried about Iran and Hezbollah striking back at them. And, you know, like the symbolism there. So Netanyahu can go hide in a bunker while the rest of his country is endangered because of his policies, because of his extermination campaign in Gaza and his attempt to escalate by trying to drag in Hezbollah and Iran. From the start, Hezbollah has said, we will stop shelling Israel if there's a ceasefire. Iran has tried to be restrained as well. They totally telegraphed their retaliation back in April when Israel bombed the Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus. They timed it to make sure that Israel could knock down Iranian missiles to thereby avoid an escalation, because it's clear what Iran and Hezbollah want, which is a ceasefire. So Netanyahu has avoided all that, all he could. He's tried to escalate. And what does he go now and do? He goes and hides in a bunker and is leaving his country exposed to the consequences of his reckless policies.
I want to run a clip. It's a little on the long side, but it's very interesting, of my friend and former colleague, Lucas Tomlinson, who's a Fox News producer in the Pentagon, attempting to grill General Pat Ryder. Lucas himself is a former Navy SEAL, now in private critical of the government, but here he is trying to get a straight answer out of General Ryder.
Secretary Austin will take every possible step to defend Israel. Does that include taking offensive strikes against Iran?
Look, again, we are focused on supporting the defense of Israel, de-escalating the situation, and preventing a broader conflict. I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. I'm not going to get into hypotheticals.
Rule it out.
Rule what out?
Taking strikes against Iran.
You're saying the U.S. taking preemptive strikes.
If Israel is attacked in a major...
So you're getting into hypotheticals. You started it with if, and I'm going to not get into hypotheticals. So, there you go. Thanks.
Important to be clear to
Brad, I think we're being pretty clear, Lucas. We're sending significant... I'm being very clear to Lucas and Iran that we are sending significant capabilities in the region to protect our forces and support the defense of Israel and respond to a wide variety of contingencies. If you look at the strategic goal here, it's to de-escalate the situation and prevent a wider regional war. And that requires diplomacy, it requires military force presence, and it requires being smart about how we go about doing this. We're not seeking conflict. We don't want conflict. But we're going to do what we need to do to support the defense of Israel and support the protection of our forces. But again, the underlying message here is we're working to de-escalate tensions. No one wants a wider war.
So you de-escalate tensions by sending an aircraft carrier with all of its support ships. He's as bad as those two characters from the State Department that Max likes to taunt, and Admiral Kirby. He's just a little bit less smarmy than the two of them. But you can't get a straight answer out of him.
Well, no, because he's in the awkward position of basically, being in a military that's supposed to defend the United States, but has been tasked with also defending a foreign country, Israel. And if we were honest, I think then members of the armed forces, when they take an oath to defend the country, they'd be asked to also take an oath to defend Israel, because practically that's what they're being told to do. Imagine being someone who signs up to serve in the armed forces for whatever reason, out of patriotism, or perhaps you need help paying for college, whatever it is that leads one into armed service. And you go there signing up to defend your country, but yet now you're being asked to ship off to the Middle East to go defend a foreign apartheid state. Did anybody sign up for that? And would they have signed up if that's what the original bargain would have been? I strongly doubt it. But yet that's considered normal here in the U.S.
Aaron Maté, thank you very much, my dear friend. Articulate as always.